Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week you'll hear our chat with the author of Countering Dispossession, Reclaiming Land, a Social Movement Ethnography, the political ecologist David E. Gilbert, not to be confused with the former Weather Underground prisoner in the U.S. For this episode, David and I speak about the book, the small community in South Sumatra, Indonesia, known as Casiavera, the legacy of colonial land grabs, the people who live there, and the agroecology of the rainforest at the base of the Aran volcano. You can find more of David's work at davidegilbert.com, and you can check the show notes for a bunch of links. As always, we hope you enjoy the chat, and if you're listening to the radio edition, we suggest that you check out the podcast at our website or on various streaming services listed at tfsr.media for another 30 minutes of chat. To throw in a couple of quick announcements, happy upcoming May Day, comrades known and unknown. I hope that wherever you are and whatever you do, you're surrounded by siblings in love and struggle. You can take pleasure in the beauty of the world around you, take strength from our predecessors who share our vision of life, unencumbered by state, capital, and other anchors foisted on our shoulders, and with the energy to create a path towards our desires and liberation for everyone. Another announcement, we had an interview scheduled with Ángel Espinosa Villegas, a trans masc butch dyke, formerly a 2020 uprising prisoner, who was transferred to ICE detention for deportation after their sentence ended. However, the Chota decided to escalate the deportation to Chile rather than let her continue to speak to the media. Keep an eye out for upcoming interviews with Ángel, either with us or with The Intercept. And also, you could visit her GoFundMe, linked in our show notes, to help support her getting back on the ground in Chile. Finally, one kind of long one. Hey listeners, we've had a string of early releases with more on the way coming out through our Patreon for supporters at $3 or more a month, alongside other thank you gifts that we offer. If you can kick in and help, the funds go to our online hosting, the creation of promotional materials like shirts and stickers, but mostly to funding our transcription efforts. We hate to ask for money, but if you have the capacity to kick us a few bucks a month, either through that Patreon or via Venmo, PayPal, or LiberaPay, where you can do recurring payments if you want to, and also in like somewhat anonymized manners, or if you want to support us by buying merch from us, we are just going to get an order of a few 3X, 4X, and 5X size t-shirts in Kelly Green coming in the mail soon. We'd very much appreciate the support. On that note, we're actually hoping to make a big sticker order in the near future. If you need another motivator, the 15th anniversary of the Final Straw Radio is coming up on May 9th, 2025. We're not above accepting birthday presents. It's 15 years of weekly audio, albeit at the beginning it was more music than talk. 7 years of which aren't even showing up in our podcast stream because we didn't use that podcast stream until 2017. So you can find those earlier shows just by going to the blog and scrolling to the bottom and clicking the highest number that you see on the bottom. But yeah, you can find our first show where we interviewed some folks who had been attacked in a series of trans and queer bashings that had happened in Asheville, and they were organizing a march against fear and against the bashings, and there was discussion about whether or not to allow the cops to show up. Spoiler, the guests didn't want the cops to show up. Other ways to support our show include rating and reviewing us on Google, Apple, and Amazon, and other podcasting platforms. You could print out and mail our interviews to prisoners. You can translate our transcripts and post them online or share them with us for us to post. You could use our audio or text as the basis for a discussion of an ongoing movement, struggle, or book that you're looking to read. You could quote our audio in your project. You could contact local radio stations to get us on the airwaves, and you could also talk to others about us in person or on social media if someone's looking for a new podcast to check out. We always appreciate that. All right, just capping that shameless plug, just want to say thanks again for listening. Thanks for 15 good years, and we look forward to continuing to produce this.
I'm David Gilbert, and I'm a political ecologist from California, and I've worked a long time in Southern America, Indonesia, and now I live and work in Barcelona in Spain. And I'm really most interested in kind of threading this line of like, what is a anarchist political ecology? What does an anarchist praxis look like both in terms of theorizing and also in strategy and tactics and politics, like really broadly construed.
Cool. Thanks a lot for taking the time to have this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
So I'm excited to speak to you about countering dispossession, reclaiming land, a social movement ethnography, which you published through UC Press. Would you talk a bit about your academic work, the sort of ethical framework or methodology that you work from, and what brought you to Casiavera?
Yeah, I first went to Indonesia now about 15 years ago, working for a local NGO out there, where I learned really quickly like how much I had to learn still about things like the importance of forests, biodiversity, conservation, and how those things are connected to some really surprising like geopolitical parts of our world. Like I ended up working in a place that had experienced like 30 years of real civil war, Aceh, Indonesia. And it came right after a peace treaty had finally been called where Aceh became what's called like a special autonomous region. So yeah, I learned really quick that like, yeah, biodiversity, conservation, like these incredible, like more than human beings, like orangutans that are highly endangered, rhinos, tigers, Sumatran tigers. These things are like intimately connected to like the geopolitics of oil and like the trade of commerce through the Malacca Strait, like one of the most important like shipping fleets for the world's commodities, where Aceh is right there, kind of controlling these areas. And I started to realize really quickly that so much of what we think of like in the North and in America, especially where I'm from, California, so much of what we think as food, as industrial products, like all of this stuff is actually coming from out there. Like Indonesia in particular is a huge supplier of the world's commodities. And all of them are kind of like coming through, this shipping channel, this area, this broader economy of like Asia, of course, right? The Pacific Rim, China, Japan. And I became really fascinated in trying to understand like how we can disrupt some of those connections. I worked for a long time after I first lived in Indonesia. I ended up moving back to the US and working as an activist and campaigner and researcher on a campaign against industrial food. Like some of the biggest US agricultural companies, like this company Cargill, people call it the biggest company you may have never heard of. They control like a huge amount of the food system, like just how we get our food in the US, like all types of things, like from corn to palm oil, specifically in Indonesia, to all sorts of commodities we never really think about, like the stuff that like makes up your lipstick, or like the stuff that, that we use when we like need to take a pharmaceutical, like medication. A lot of these like feedstocks, these commodities are coming from Indonesia, other places in Asia as well. So yeah, I worked really hard on like trying to figure out how to disrupt some of these systems, like because of course this is like capitalism and it's the problems of environmental, ecological crisis, and the ways we're kind of consuming, like we become like a consumer society, and that led me like really deep for like years to go and start moving and writing with some like organizers around land and peasants and the people that are trying to control these areas of Indonesia. Like, there's hundreds of millions of people that live on the land out there producing all these commodities, rubber, palm oil, tobacco, like avocados, like cinnamon, like the pepper that Kentucky Fried Chicken buys by like the metric ton. Like all of this stuff was coming from these areas, and these people were trying to figure out ways to kind of do things differently, right? Like rather than these giant industrial food systems. And that led me, after years, a friend, an organizer, and more kind of an environmentalist, like working with a group in Indonesia that's a lot like, kind of like a Greenpeace type group. They're called Walhi. But they're like real kind of like organizers in a way that I don't think Greenpeace is really. Like Greenpeace kind of does actions and does media, but like Walhi is very like organizing communities and factions within these communities against like all the plantations, the big extractive like mining projects and others in Indonesia. But this guy from he told me to go check out Casiavera, this incredible town in Sumatra on the Aden volcano. And it had become famous there for what they'd been able to accomplish in terms of like overthrowing the domination of one of these big industrial agricultural plantations, a plantation that had like really deep roots, like almost like 100-year-old plantation there that started during Dutch colonialism and then became like reformulated and became even more like just terrible actually during the New Order, like Indonesia's long dictatorship, like one of the most like murderous regimes of the 20th century. And one of the most long-running like dictatorships under General Suharto is his name. And so I went there. I actually went there the first time with this huge delegation. There were representatives from over 30 countries that came, organized through Via Campesina, the largest like peasant union in the world organization. This type of organization that's really working campaigning, but also like organizing and activating and getting people into protest, getting people like really deep into cooperative forms of production across the world. They have over 200 million members, but they chose Casiavera as a source of like inspiration and, not necessarily a blueprint, but like, ideas that we can think about that can resonate with other movements. So that was the first time I went there, and I just stayed there a few days and I was really intrigued by what I saw there. So I ended up going back for my graduate studies in anthropology or like in environmental anthropology. And I've spent now like almost 2 years there. That was first in 2013. So it's been more than a decade of my engagement and like collaboration there. And this is kind of like a long-winded like response to thinking about like what does ethnography mean and like my frameworks and how can it be both kind of like a praxis or like a scholarly endeavor that's really trying to orient social movements in a way from within or just give feedback to them or even just create like a history of certain movements, which I think my book, I really do think of as like almost like a history of the specific place and the social movement that has unfolded there. But, a lot about it was like finding one of these stories that people really wanted to tell. Like I spent a lot of time in the worst plantations with the most land conflict where, private security is like patrolling the plantation with attack dogs. And like, these are like Muslim people who hate dogs, and arm people, with weapons, police, special forces, police, have killed people in these type of struggles. And I have documented some of that stuff in my work a fair amount. I have like a piece of work about like paramilitary forms and their connections with the police state in Indonesia, how they enforce plantation lands violence, and also like the disruption of social movements, this idea of repression directly. But for my book, like I found a place where people really did want to talk about their history. Like it's a long, troubled, difficult history, but people wanted others to know what they had accomplished. And so, when I started living there, I quickly realized like this area that was once just a basically messed up, like exposed soil, really damaged plantation ecology had been turned into what looked like a beautiful natural rainforest. It was actually all planted by the people that occupied this plantation and were able to eventually reclaim it and start doing this amazing form of what we call agroecology or like tree farming or food forests on this land. And by the time I came to visit almost like 20 years into their occupation or reclamation, it was full of like over 40 different types of like really important like fruits, spices. These are commodities that they sell like into the world market locally, but also into the world market. But they were like doing it in a way that was not capitalist at all. And that was really inspiring for me when I think about like social movements require protest and direct action. And this movement required a blockade to like protect themselves from the police that came to kick them off the land that they had reclaimed, without legal right to do so, even though that most of them have like ancestral ties to that place. And almost all of them had worked as plantation laborers, or coolies as they called them in this plantation. And they did all these things like, really like brave, like they called themselves like reckless at times, like, carrying lightweight weapons, like kind of how the Black Bloc is armed these days sometimes. But, they carried machetes and, they did all these things, men and women, but they also did this like incredible like building of this world, like of this forest, of this ecology. They made over 15 cooperatives to sell different things. Like, for example, they had a lot of banana palms. They have a banana cooperative. They have like a cattle cooperative, a dairy operation that's also a collective. Just like the incredible building up of their economy that allowed them to sustain, this reclamation and this type of activism, and recognizing that like we need to understand like people ourselves engaged in struggles can't always be doing just one or the other. There has to be some type of flow. There has to be some type of change over people's lives. And yeah, all of those things I found incredibly informative to think about what different type of struggles especially for land back, like could mean. And yeah, in the book, I try to be really careful and cautious and like show how difficult that was for people, and that over half the families that tried to cultivate this plot on this reclamation failed, and there's still capitalism, and like there's still predatory lenders there, and there's still really bad ways of like getting stuck with bosses and loans and miscommunications. And it's far from a perfect place, but it really helped me think through like what are the connections to Bay Area reclaiming land? What does like recognizing that land back is nothing less than like the full indigenous control of like Turtle Island, for example, where the movement is strongest. And I think we can kind of say, at least in this language of land back originated, but of course land back movements are like more broadly these streams of like indigenous sovereignty and anti-colonial struggle that have existed like all over the world for hundreds of years, right? But like land back in particular, recognizing that that's the goal and objective of land back, then, and the fact that like a lot of the forms of community and collective organization that's required to have like a full-blown modern polity that can really be like a truly anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, like indigenous-led polity, all of those forms in like California have basically been lost, or not just lost, but destroyed and shattered by white settler colonialism, right? So here in Casiavera, there's actually a lot of these forms are in place, and some of them have been maintained throughout this colonial domination. Like there was and still is a customary council with a lot of power there, but also like the peasant union like created a new structure that was very powerful and very present there. They also were engaged like with the state in interesting ways. Like they were very anti-state, but like their ultimate claim wasn't actually like to destroy or smash the state. It was like to get their land back. And that's what they did in a very like smart and aggressive way. And I think that's also like, just thinking strategically, like a lot of different movements can think like and build a lot from this more general kind of concept I lay out, which is like this, we need to integrate and be smart about when we deploy direct action and these like real economic, like mutual aid, solidarity economies that we have to build as well, right? And I think that it's been really satisfying to have conversations with Indonesian activists, feminists, like plantation scholars in Indonesia. Like there's been some really great conversations about like what now Casiavera means for a movement and how we think about getting land back here as in like Barcelona, here as in California, here as in Indonesia. Like there's a lot of differences, but I think these are the conversations we need to have now more than ever, especially under Trump, where like it seems like no matter what you think about the state or your level of engagement with it, like everywhere from like actual city, county, state governments are trying to defy and evade and like disrupt in a way, and like social movements that are like very much like about struggle. Like everyone needs to be thinking about these things now in a way that like, we need to for a long time, but like it's just become hyper clear in the last like few months actually. So hopefully, we can continue to talk about some of the finer points about that kind of broad like introduction. I've been like really inspired by the work that you guys have been doing in your show, and I'm happy to take it any direction. But I think like I'd love to try to leave some room at some point in the next few minutes to think about some of these like, different sites of struggle and how they might relate. Like we could have like a bit of like a relational like comparison discussion. I've been thinking a lot about like Stop Cop City, also Standing Rock again. I know it's been so long, but like I've went back and kind of I read a new book about Standing Rock that was interesting. And
what's it called?
It's called The Black Snake.
Okay.
And it's by a journalist, I forget her name right now, but yeah, she just reminded me about like the importance of the protest camp itself. Like not so much that Standing Rock was a blockade, but it was more a camp. Like, and in Casiavera, I talk about 2 acts of blockading that were like pivotal to like protecting this new reclamation or occupation. But it's a lot more about like kind of the land that itself and like what's happening on the land. And I think this was kind of the point of the book about Standing Rock, was like the greatest revolutionary or like emancipatory, maybe less revolutionary, but yeah, emancipatory potential of Standing Rock was everything that was happening in the camps or the camp. And like, I think the protest camp, I mean, it's kind of a weird term because like for some of us, like myself, like I always like associate the camp with kind of like a negative thing sometimes. But I think in a land back sense and like Turtle Island and the people that were at Standing Rock, I didn't go. There's kind of a long story there, but the camp is like, one of the most beautiful central positive parts of life, like moving across the landscape, breaking camp, opening camp, having ceremony. So yeah, that part was really resonant with me with my experience in what I saw and learned in Casiavera. It was like the blockade part of the struggle can only be a few moments even of just what people are trying to sustain. And I think myself, like as an activist, have at times like, it took me kind of into having to write this book to learn that lesson in a really fundamental way. Like I've always been down to protest and ride and get involved in actions, but I've never like truly turned myself to this one place, like one plot of land or like the Rosebud protest camp and all the dynamics that are happening within just like a few family groups, as in Casiavera, or just a few hundred people that are getting to know each other at like Rosebud. Like this is the thing that must be sustained, by any means. But and it's such a tiny kind of little micro world, but Casiavera has impacted the lives of now like thousands of families. So it's still small. It's not even a big city worth of people, but I think that these human scale, like really foundational changes to the way things operate are going to be the way that we can enact some sort of, hopefully, at least like semi-peaceful change. Like, I just think thinking on the scales of changes of millions right now, like brings us so into the eye of like the imperial geopolitical like war machine that it's hard for me to see like what huge like rapturous revolutionary change would happen right now without it being like, unfortunately, a highly militarized, repressed, struggle. So yeah, that's why like I've been really inspired by Casiavera, knowing that like, and in the book I talk about it, there's thousands of other places that bring together like hundreds of thousands of families in struggle, impacting millions of hectares of land, which is like the size of like half of California, like Northern California or something. So what like Serikat Petani Indonesia, the specific peasant union, which is just one of many in Indonesia, but the one that was most active in Casiavera, what they've done on that kind of scale is world changing, and I think it's unfortunately like suffering like all these rising authoritarians right now, like, in the last decade or two across the world. Like, unfortunately, Indonesia's kind of been caught up in that now just in the last year or two or three. So, it's yet to be seen to be like how much they could continue to grow their movements. All of these movements in Indonesia, these peasant movements, basically started around the year 2000, more or less. That was the first time they were able to operate at least legally, like above ground, because of the new order, basically. And so, like, 20 years is not that long to grow like a nonviolent movement. Like, they're not underground anymore. but that also means that they don't have to operate only as criminals, right? So like we learned with the Zapatistas, like they were underground for about 2 decades, like before their first uprising, like their armed like reclamation of their territory. And that was actually similar to SPI and to Casiavera in particular. It was actually almost the exact same time in the early, like mid 80s and then late 80s. It was underground, and then in the 90s, late 90s, both like movements went above ground. And I find it interesting that there's this convergence of time, like also with the MST. That was like in Brazil, that was a really important time for them to consolidate and grow. And now all of these movements, I feel like are a bit at like a wait and see, like what's happening right now. I mean, Brazil is a little bit different, and the Zapatistas might be as weak as they've been in a long time. It seems like, I don't know.
And for folks who don't know MST, that's the landless workers movement in Brazil, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, where there's a lot of interchange and overlap in building between MST and the group in Casiavera across Indonesia in particular, and through Via Campesina. And there they've like really been refining, right, this land reclamation or occupation or squatting. Like there's so many different names for what these groups do, but Brazil has the largest movement of reclaiming land from industrial corporations, or as in the case more specifically in Brazil, often it's like really large, wealthy landowners, like individual families. But now more and more they're incorporated as corporations, as they all are in Indonesia. Like they're all corporations in Indonesia. So those two are the ones that I'm most familiar with in terms of what this strategy involves. And the MST has done more than the Indonesian unions have, like in not only making it a matter of activism, like occupying land, and like economic collectives and how you do this idea of agroecology, but the MST has gone even further with like education, health clinics, like all these things that come from Paulo Freire's like idea of pedagogies of liberation. And like you need the school, right? You need the healthcare, maybe you need the communal kitchen. And I think that's one thing that the Indonesian movements haven't done as much of. And those type of movements like just seem so important for the US right now. And it's like Operation Jackson, build and fight and build. Like everywhere we look, we have places like that in the US, right? And they've been coming out in the last decade or two, maybe these like very anarchist, like reconsolidations of like the kind of third world Marxism of the 70s, like, or Black Panther Party, like formulations, like, but more anarchist now. And this is kind of what happened in Indonesia just a few decades ago, where all these groups emerged. Indonesia had the largest communist party outside of the USSR and China in the 60s, which was completely dismantled and destroyed and killed by this new order, right? This violent regime. And so basically, after about a decade or two after this like terrible pogrom against all the leftists, these more anarchist kind of mutual aid groups around these industrial plantations started forming, of which was like the genesis of the movement in Casiavera. Then they federalized. So Serikat Petani Indonesia was the coming together of these 20-something smaller peasant unions that had reformulated. And so like I'm wondering if in the US, like this is a time to think about that type of strategy really strongly, like the mutual aid solidarity groups that have been growing the last few decades. Is it time to federalize in terms of anarchist federations? Like it's not about dissolving people's autonomy, but to really solidify like how much we can support each other. And then of course, like we think about some of the old school anarchists, like white European anarchists, and like what they thought could come out of federalizing, and then add in like indigenous ideas of federations that, are some of the strongest in the world, like, in the US, with the Iroquois Federation, like at the moment of colonialization. I mean, that was one of the strongest like non-states or like, indigenous polities that ever existed. When the French and the British came up against that polity, like they were stunned by its power and by its military power as well. And like we see this, I've learned this history more now, and I wish I had had a chance to get it in the book, but I've learned it more now being in Spain. Where did the actual military power come from the revolutionary forces of Spain on the left during their civil war? It came from the federation of these unions, workers' unions, that created their own self-defense units, guards, right? That were, because the unions were federalized, they were able to coordinate these truly kind of like anarchist self-defense units that were almost unstoppable for a while. So like, I think these are the type of ramifications that could come out of like looking really closely at Casiavera and what they've accomplished, like in terms of where organizing could take all of us, or where their organizing took them.
Yeah, I think to address a couple of things that you said, I take inspiration. I haven't been paying as much attention since 2021 probably, but struggles at Yinta and Wet'suwet'en lands, and what's the name of the big, like there was a big long-lasting land occupation in so-called Alberta, but Indigenous organizing mostly north of the border with warrior societies, I think creating some sort of that federated framework. Projects like Cooperation Jackson, Cooperation Jackson itself comes out of the Republic of New Africa framework and has the folks that run it are very Leninist, but other projects that are affiliated with it will tend to have more communalist or libertarian municipalist perspectives, like the later writings of Murray Bookchin. And there's a network that a bunch of the cooperations like Tulsa and a bunch of similar, whether it be like land back or socio-ecological, alternative economy, parallel economy, dual power projects have sort of gotten together. That's called Symbiosis Network. I don't know how active they are right now, but at least 2019, 2020, they were pulling a lot of inspiration from what was happening in Rojava, and there was a lot of back and forth. So when people were talking about the Make Rojava Green Again, a lot of the folks that were a part of that movement in the U.S. were also clued into the Symbiosis Network, which I think is really great. I think it's also like with what you said about the communist movement in Indonesia, it's also worth pointing to the fact that the Bandung Conference happened in that country also, right? So the conceptualization of third world as a positionality outside of Soviet sphere or US sphere, and communities, a lot of them indigenous and anti-capitalist, looking for another route outside of the industrial megaliths of those two empires, tried to go their own way with some sort of like federative option that was outside of the first and second world, which is probably one big reason that was a target of U.S. imperialism and those pogroms that you were talking about, right?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that like nothing said, the power of the West, like the arms the West was willing to send to Indonesia right at that moment, like post-Cold War or post-World War II, where the Cold War was forming, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to survive this like really difficult transition as a new Indonesian republic, it was called. And their first President Sukarno, you could see he loved the West. He also loved like Russia, and there was like no propaganda like the Russian like military planes for him. Like, I mean, he was a true freedom fighter. Like he truly fought like the Dutch for freedom in Java. And he had like a great appreciation for the independence of like both forces. And, it's so easy to be like judgmental and be like, how could you ever like support capitalists and imperialists? But like Sukarno and Indonesia had just been betrayed by the Japanese, of all people, who at the time, these were the liberators of Asia. They called themselves comrades or, brothers, Japan and Indonesia. But what happened was Japan ended up invading Indonesia during World War II and being as brutal and sadistic as the Dutch were or had been. And it was this great betrayal for Sukarno and the other young, like revolutionary leftists. I mean, they were true socialists, but this betrayal made them much more like pragmatic towards all these different blocs. And, the idea of being a non-aligned nation was like where the young republic wanted to place itself, its leaders. as they were busily trying to attend to how to create a nation at all from all these different indigenous polities that were like really strong and all had their different ideas of where they wanted this nation to go. But, you know, in the end, of course, like U.S. imperialism did predominate in Indonesia. And now, you know, we're stuck with basically these fires of revolution on the left were like basically extinguished completely in Indonesia for a very long time. And this capitalist, very like basically like the formation of capitalism was this imperialist economic exploitation of plantations, right? I mean, Indonesia was one of the original places, the Dutch East Indies, the Caribbean, Africa. This plantation model early on was known as the Java model because it was perfected in Java by the Dutch and then exported across the world by many different colonial powers. And now, like, the revolutionary thought is starting to rekindle, and the nation is like a true plantation oligarchy to this day. So, you know, I think it's important to understand that, like, now there's this vibrant, pretty underground scene of anarchists, of people that are digging up, like, Tan Malaka's thought, like, who was one of the early founders of the Indonesian anti-colonial struggle, one of the first founders of the Communist Party in Indonesia. Like, these ideas are really strong again there, but it's coming from this incredible history of like just the domination of this oligarchy. And of course, like, it's one that's highly connected to the United States and Europe, like through these flows of commodities, like we started talking about at the opening of our conversation. But it's also highly connected to China and India through the flow of these same commodities. So we're living in this really complex world now. I mean, it's always been a complex world, but, you know, the North-South thing that we love to like put into this conversation of how to destroy capitalism, it's no longer North-South like in that simple formulation. And we're starting to learn that we're in this moment of like geopolitical realignment in the world right now, and what that means for all of these relationships are really hard to understand. And I think we'll never understand them like without some history, like we'll never understand them without some perspective, also without some time of letting them play out. But like what we can return to in Casiavera is like this importance of getting started. And that's like one of their, you know, there's many things that I think are quite anarchist about Casiavera's movement, including the fact that they call themselves anarchos and talk about Prodeen. But they also talk about themselves as socialists, or I was really surprised, like people were talking about Heidegger. Like, I don't know. I mean, anyway, it's a place where people read a lot of books. They read a lot of political books. They read a lot of, philosophy. It's all been translated into Indonesian, but you know, they certainly identified themselves as anarchists, as believing that individual property is death, you know, and people actually quoted that to me, which I think is straight up out of Prodeen. But like, when you start to think about, well, where did Prodeen get it from? Maybe like from the French experience in the New World. Like, you know, there's just so many different ways these ideas exist out in the world. And, you know, who am I to say that, oh, in Indonesia, they're learning from European anarchism or the other way around? I really don't know. But yeah, property is death was an important one. Also, this one of like just relentlessly trying to refuse hierarchy and rotating leadership throughout these councils was really important. On the flip side, though, like Indonesian Peasant Union have had the same like quote unquote leader and founder for like 20 years. And we see that also with the MST, that like, I think they're very much, you know, Marxist-Leninist inspired organizations that actually practice a lot of indigenous and anarcho-indigenous like ideas and practices up to a certain extent. And then we start to understand like they could go a lot further, I think, and activate themselves a lot more if they had like some more rotating hierarchy. Of course, like that's a whole another big like long conversation about like how to create mass movements through what type of like structuring the party and all that. But you know, I think Casiavera never got too hung up on those ideas, and part of it was because it's just like a lot of work to like, well, one, to occupy a plantation, like in their context was like they needed to make a living. They also needed to sneak around and avoid these little security forces and start planting things in the cracks of this plantation. And then they got really bold and blocked this road, and they eventually destroyed the workers' barracks and offices in the middle of the plantation in active protest. And then they had to get busy like trying to figure out how to make this land productive and how to manage it together. They had all these different ideas about what forms the collectives would be and cooperatives. And in the end, they settled on this like really kind of simple solution of individuals could have these defined plots, but they couldn't buy or sell the land. And they only could use it as long as they were actually using it. Like they only have a right to it as long as they were actually using it. So like they figured out how to hold on to the land, and they also figured out how to start making a living from it. But there's no commodification of the land. It's not commodified for labor either, really, because they don't like pay each other to work it. They have kind of like work exchanges or these collectives where people work together, and then they receive like a percentage of the profits back, if there are any. Often there's not. And then they're all doing other things too to make livings. Many people do construction. Many people have like a government job. You know, one of the main peasant union organizers was working within the state for a long time as like an agricultural extension officer, you would call it, I guess, in the US, like someone that works for the FDA. So like you see these pragmatic decisions, but also like that guy was like a straight up like anarchist infiltrator. Like that guy is the real deal. And he worked for the New Order, you know? And of course, almost everyone did that's a certain age, or not worked for the government, but many people were alive living their lives during that time. So many people have, you know, some really surprising, disturbing stories like, oh, wow, you were the guy with the gun that was like hunting communists, and now you want to be an Indonesian peasant union member. And people know that guy's history, but it's also a way of like healing some of those traumas and bringing people back in instead of just ostracizing and only creating more conflict in a community. Like bringing someone in is an act of forgiveness, right? And so, yeah, we learn about these things about how to operate. Like some people would call it realpolitik. That's like some crazy Russian word about like, you know, why it's excusable to execute someone, you know, if it's going to accomplish the revolution. And so I don't know if I love that word, but like the actual like ways of dealing with each other and working together and building and getting over trauma, like all of these things, you know, movements are struggling with, right? And conversations are happening, and we need a lot more of them for sure.
So one of the things that you've talked about is like the continuation, the influence of indigenous life ways. And so if this community lived through Dutch colonization, which attempt to change everyone's life and turn people into laborers for export for the profit of the Dutch corporation that was running it, or running the government as a corporation, or smaller plantations, right? And then you've got the Japanese exploitation, and then you've got maybe a national independence period where there was some waviness about what was going to happen, and then the New Order. You had the imposition of modern nation state frameworks and property ideas that are central to Western capitalism that were being imposed over and over again. And one of the successes that you point to in the book is the fact that despite whether calling indigenous practices communists during the New Order period and hunting people in the mountains for collectivizing territory, or James C. Scott sort of idea of like evading the awareness or visibility, legibility by the state, you had communities resisting throughout this time, carrying the knowledge somehow, even though a lot of the knowledge was also destroyed of how to caretake the land and live with it. They still had matriarchal values. They still had indigenous councils based on lineage. Can you talk a little bit about some of these structures as you understand them that were able to survive, and what sort of stuff they've been able to relearn? And was that like relearning through things like communication with MST and like Via Campesina and learning from other indigenous communities elsewhere? Sorry, that's a lot in there. I guess I'm wondering about like the survival of indigenous practices through various colonizations that survive to today, if you could talk about those.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I think one of the most remarkable things about Indonesia is the fact that there are so many indigenous, and some of them matriarchal, some of them more patriarchal, some of them like quite anti-hierarchical, others like quite hierarchical and like patronizing even. But all of these ideas have existed and changed and made up every piece of their culture throughout this period of domination by the Dutch and then the Javanese and then this crazy military dictatorship of mostly Javanese people. Like the fact that these institutions, most of them, I would say, although it's hard, it's such a big question, but at least in Casiavera, very clearly we could see that this matrilineal control of land as a collective that was governed by these councils of family lineage members that were elected by the families. And there's a women's council, there's a men's council, there's a mixed council. This is like a really incredible and fantastic and interesting and different way of thinking about property and governing it that still exists today. And of course, it's changed a lot over the last 300 years. But when we start to think of like what a world of freedom or autonomy or just like well-being would be, for me, it's like maybe it's just because I was like schooled in civics as like an American when I was very young, but I think about the balance of powers. Like, I think that this might be a really fundamental idea a little bit, that like this matrilineal council in Casiavera, it exists. It survived. It was changed. It was altered. It was probably diminished a bit, unfortunately, by the Dutch and the New Order as well, because the Javanese, like patriarchal, like very hierarchical dictatorship was very anti. It's called Minangkabau culture in this case in West Sumatra. But the Minangkabau survived, and it's one of the balances of powers with the peasant union, with the state, and also I would say I think the church, or in this case the mosque, formal Islamic state or religious powers. There's almost like four main powers that kind of ended up pushing out the plantation company, and the state didn't really do much pushing, but it also didn't ever bring to bear like its worst forms of repression on Casiavera. And part of that was because of the Minangkabau Matrilineal Council and the fact that the Minangkabau aren't really like the people that are the most marginalized or made other, or like the people that are the most subjected to racism in Indonesia. They're kind of like a mainstream indigenous society there. So the state was, I think, a lot less willing to be like, look at these peasant Minangkabau people, we're going to erase them off the map, like they have done with some people, like the Dayak peoples in Kalimantan, for example, or in Sumatra, like with the Jambanese peoples, who are much more like a racialized, like minority indigenous group than the Minangkabau are. But also because, in Casiavera, many members of leadership in the mosque like began actually to really abhor the plantation. And this is not a common thing, I don't think, in Indonesia. But in this case, many of the religious leaders, like, they just felt like it was a absolute affront, like to have actually, it was actually a retired military police general that ran this plantation. And they thought, that the exploitation of the land and the people that were working there just wasn't really acceptable. And then, of course, you had the peasant union. So there was this balance of powers, and they all kind of formed to work in different ways to push out the plantation or to dismantle it from right within it itself, actually, in an interesting way. And without that indigenous polity, without those structures of rule, the customary council, I'm not sure that it would happen. And I think that that's where people kind of get hung up when they start to think about these type of movements, like especially, here in Europe, people like have so much learning to do about what like indigenous means, and how everywhere in the world there's an imperfect idea of like indigenous politics, because many people here are just like, okay, that's an interesting story, but we don't have anything like that here. But like Spain is full of these local assemblies or councils. Like, they're usually organized around very small little communities or villages. But even like in Barcelona, it like has a city council structure, or we call it municipalism, right? In the language of like Bukchin that you mentioned, or Rojava, that those councils while not equivalent to like the Casiavera Indigenous Minangkabau Customary Council, they actually have a great potential to operate in the same way in terms of these balances of powers. But it's just that their power is much greater. You know, in the U.S. system, you can think about like what does a city council truly control? They certainly don't like control much to do with like any of the apparatuses of violence of the state. Like, I don't think. Indonesia, they don't technically either, but they kind of have created in certain places more room to operate, and to, like a more forceful no or a more forceful affirmative like decision in a place can be made that really does conflict at times with, like, in Indonesia we call it the republic law, but that would be like the federal law in the US, right? And I'm also like a little bit hesitant to allow that whole like crazy box to open in the US, because like we think of a lot of like localized rule as being really tyrannical and it's scary and violent and white and racist and white nationalists and white supremacists in the US. So, you know, I think there's a hesitancy to like disparage the role of like broader state structures that could help keep like minorities safe in the US in a way that maybe is different in Indonesia.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And yeah, when you talk about like constitutional sheriffs as a concept in the United States, like it's about the autonomy of this like settler role. And that's maybe a thing, is that we're talking about a still like settler majority country, and the model is around applying white supremacist expansionism throughout it as a shared content. But then again, like in small communities, sometimes when there is input from polities, like lower levels of governance can be more directly democratic. I mean, in our city, the city council can be vetoed at any point by the city manager, which is an appointed position, and they have control over the budget and the police department and everything, and then it sits within a county that has its own. But not to get too far down there. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. Check out other shows on the network and stream some episodes at channelzeronetwork.com. But don't just take our word for it.
Here at the Channel Zero Network, we give no preferential treatment to liberals or conservatives. They all remain duct-taped in the basement until their respective ransoms are paid in full. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain with the Final Straw radio show on the Channel Zero Network. Channel Zero Network, because every countdown ends at zero.
Stop now! What's that sign? Everybody look what's going down! Stop now! What's that sign?
I thought it's cool. It was interesting to hear you talk about again, to use like a Book Chin term, it's not his term, but one that he uses, as far as dispersion of the land and use of the land, the concept of usufruct, I think you bring up in the book, but this idea of not ownership necessarily, but right to something by use, but that something exists past your use and can be used by someone else. And that as a concept of exchange that, like, in some of Bookchin's writings, Bookchin said this is like a fundamental of a lot of indigenous communities, of like, we don't own this, we live with this, and it can't be distinctly ours. And it's cool how the council in Casiavera has like worked to minimize the consolidation of ownership, because they're very aware. They're not like they're post-civ like model that's aware of problems that they've experienced along the way, and they're trying to like work through as they go, with, you know, allowing for stuff to fall through the cracks, because people are human and they don't want to bring down a fist and alienate everyone in the community. Like when they started telling people no tree crops, because that more permanently ties you to a land base, and people started doing it. They're like, well, okay, we're not going to stop you from that. And the term that you use in the book, or that's used in the book, smallholder, is an interesting idea to me. Like within a collective, like the Soviet model was like forced collectivization that was centralized under the state. And that was obviously a failure. It caused like, people were not invested in the land that they were directly working in. They viewed it as a job. And so that for sort of like forced collectivization in the standard of the state being the representative of the collective poisoned the well of that goodwill, if not through bureaucracy, squash the like creative potentials of the people involved. But like the Proudhonian like reference that you make of small holders, small business people, whatever, doing a thing, living in community with each other, maybe trading, maybe hiring someone for a couple days a week as a wage worker, but they get to go back to their plot, and that person who hires them is not in control of their means of survival directly. They're just picking up a little money on the side. Like, that heterogeny, I think, is like pretty natural, and even would probably, to a lot of like conservative people in the US, be considered an ideal model of how a community operates. A small town with a main street, you've got a teacher, you've got a couple of doctors, you've got all these roles are filled by people in the community. It's relatively like sustained by the community, and people make decisions collaboratively within that community about what happens to the community and to the resources or to the, you know, the land that they're living on. And because it's like modeled in a place with certain sets of experiences and cultural frameworks, you make the point of saying, like, and you've said it before, like, it's not a blueprint. This is not a thing that people should read Countering Dispossession, Reclaiming Land as something to pick up and put down somewhere else and stamp into some other landscape with other people, because it's not how it works. But maybe a part of the indigeneity or the essence in there that's of it is that it is of the place and of the time of the people that are in relation to the land. So not only the social structures that are developed out of that community and those relationships, but also people's communal relationship with the land, fostering diversity, bringing back space for other animals to come and live. Sorry, that was a big mouthful, but like I love the fact that the fact that it's not a recipe that can just be picked up and plastered out somewhere else, but that it's a general framework and an invitation to a set of practices that people would adopt to their own situation and learn with as it evolves and as people's needs evolve.
Yeah, that is so inspiring, and is that point of overlap is fascinating to me. Of like, not to romanticize like the rural too much, but yes, this idea that we could have ways of living that appeal to many people in this world. I don't know if we could say they're fundamental to human experience, but you know, there may be something to this idea that we can live in a way, you know, you said like heterogeneity, and I say like in the book, like bricolage, or like a mosaic of types of work where we own our own means of production. Yes, like maybe it's the land, maybe it's like your 3D printer, maybe it's, you know, you could think of any form of kind of cottage.
Your labor.
Industry. Yeah, exactly. And that would allow us like a more satisfying, more interesting, also like having the ability to change our work over time over the course of our own lives. These are things that certainly are possible under like, you know, neoliberal capitalism or late stage modernist capitalist like economies. But, you know, in a way, there's something fundamentally like opposed to that concept of work within the bricolage approach. And it's much more about maintaining autonomy and freedom and that family orientation around economic activity. That like when you go to a place like in Casiavera where the corporations don't exist, you realize in a way how rich everyone is. And I don't want to like overstate the wealth of this place, but you know, people are sending their kids to college there now. Many of them own, if not family cars, many of them do, but everyone has motorbikes. Not everyone. There is certainly some dire poverty in the place, but it's a quite well-off place. You feel that. You feel that in the quality of life, the quality of living, the material possessions. You know, so the sense of wealth, and of course, the Minangkabau was famous for its wealth during the colonial encounter, as many of these places were, right? That like actually quite impoverished British white settlers were often astounded by the wealth and the leisure and the quality of life that they encountered as they went off to go destroy those ways of living. And for me, I'm locating like a lot of the origins of that problem in just like that capture of rents or wealth or of money by like corporations. Like, and it's a simple message, but it's a powerful one when you see how Casiavera has put that into practice in a way that's far beyond like most places I've visited in California. Although there's some kind of communes and eco villages and like hippie spots I've been to where you start to get a sense of that. None are like so comprehensively large or like a full scale like full-scale community or even town. Like Casiavera, I would call like a town. So there's a lot to be inspired there by, and there's a lot to think through, like what does that idea of smallholder and being kind of the owner of your own means of production while at the same time being engaged with other different forms of like production and making money and getting by that do, satisfy a lot of people's needs, and how that overlaps with like what we think about it as like conservative rural America, and how strong there could be, like if we could somehow create like a truly anti-racist like rural bloc in America, how strong it could really be, and the potential, latent potential that exists, I think is huge. And I think, interestingly enough, like this idea of libertarian that we so much associate with a certain type of like Tea Party politics that maybe inspired MAGA, and maybe there's still like libertarian strains of thought operating like Ayn Rand and all that in MAGA. But it seems to have shifted a little bit just to straight oligarchy recently. But like, anyway, those libertarians were important to this rise of the right recently. And of course, that was like from the original communards of like the Paris Revolutionary Commune, the libertaires, like the libertarians in a truly anarchist sense, I would say. So like there is this fundamental overlap or interest in this form of life that spans the political spectrum in the US. And also, new African movements you mentioned. I forget exactly how we got to new Africanism earlier. Oh yeah, Cooperation Jackson. That type of survivalist new African instinct also in an interesting way like overlaps. And of course, indigenous lifeways so there's, I think that's really a fruitful ground for all of us to think about how to actually organize around this kind of concept of the smallholder across the economies and landscapes and territories, both urban and rural. And yeah, that seems like a wonderful place for us to to get to in this conversation, actually, is like that commonality, and not to be like silly about it and be like, we're going to one day activate these links between like the right and the left and all this, but just know that when we're thinking about, basis and where to organize, there's a lot of places we could look, right?
Yeah. And not to beat my drum or whatever in this, this is a necessary part of every anarchist podcast when somebody says the word libertarian, is that the majority of the world uses the term libertarian to talk about anarchists, libertarian socialists, libertarian communists, libertarian municipalists, and it's just the jackasses in the United States that use it to mean theocracy, apparently, at this point. But like the theocracy of property and masculinity. You mentioned the ecological damage that the monocropping and the industrial system translated to the soil and to the forests of the Aden area around Casiavera, and like the side of the volcano that people have made into communalized and repossessed. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how the smallholder model of working with the landscape and growing this diverse forest like has repaired the landscape and enriched the diversity of the landscape? Like, because I think that like when they have been making the point, for instance, like you've mentioned that the occupation is not technically a legal occupation, but they do have lawyers working with them. And one of the two of the claims that they've made, some of which is like based in law in Indonesia, the anti-colonial like perspective that they are uplifting the livelihoods of indigenous communities that live on the land by increasing the material wealth of people. That's one argument that they made, and that's based on like a shared value, ostensibly, that they have with that document. And then the other side is that they're repairing the ecology of the area, which I think it's cool that they're able to argue those things and sort of stave off some of the worst attacks of the state, even while it's still kind of tenuous. Like some of the shots from above, like the satellite photos, like seeing the comparison of what the soil looked like when it was going through the period of being cattle ranch, and then it transferred over to tobacco and whatever. Like, yeah, can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, when we start to think about what our world needs, like our planet, how to heal it and repair it from all the devastation, we start to think about the climate, right? And in Casiavera, they took this land that had been completely degraded and made into basically like barren soil by these monocropping systems that were first, first it was just all cut down and logged by a Dutch logging company. And then it was planted mostly in tobacco and also ginger as just a single line of one crop over and over with like pesticides sprayed, exposed soils. And so like the rains would come in Indonesia up in the mountains, like super hard rain, wash all the soil away. I mean, this went on for decades. They had some cattle up there that were just trampling everything. So I actually found some early old school like NASA satellite photographs that showed like how just this was this huge, the whole plantation was just basically bare soil in the 90s. And you can see this from space, like on the whole flanks of this mountain, this giant area. But by the time I got there, it was often like an emergent canopy rainforest of hundreds of species. Some of the tallest were things like teak and meranti and like red cedar, like these really valuable timbers. Those have been planted by the people. And I started learning, basically over like 60 different plants and trees that were living in these forests were planted on purpose. And then there were many other like follow-on species. So it's like, looks like a rainforest, it smells like a rainforest. And it turns out, of course, like that type of, we call like land use change or like just changing the environment actually sucks up all this carbon out of the atmosphere and stores it in the new soils that were created and the trees themselves as they grow. So you're actually talking about like a way to be like a natural carbon cleanser of the atmosphere, like growing these types of agroforests on the many, many, many millions of hectares of degraded land that exists across the world can actually be a contributor to cleaning up our climate. And then it goes much beyond that there, like, right? Like that these are living rainforests now. So you have like it's supporting really important species like these primates called gibbons that are not critically endangered, but they are an endangered species, I believe, in Sumatra. They live there. They make the most remarkable calls to each other in the morning. There are now Sumatran tigers, of which there's only a few hundred left in the entire island. In that area, elephants, also critically endangered. And then beyond that, you have like this whole watershed and water cycle effect where this is, on a mountain, it's actually a watershed and it's now sustaining those flows of rivers in a way that bare, huge like flank of the landscape didn't. In fact, that was just contributing to flooding downriver. So these are all cycles that like are really important across the world, and they make this threefold contribution just by reforesting. And that's one of the reasons like reforestation has become so popular for people to talk about. But, the people that are actually doing it in a way that has ecological value in this sense are most often indigenous people or like campesino people in Latin America are doing it a bunch. So we just have to remember like the best way to achieve those types of incredible ecological changes are like, and this word like empowerment has become such a cheesy word, but like what does empowering like the campesinos of Latin America really mean to let them do agroecology? It means like massive land reform. It means political struggle. It means perhaps at times armed struggle, and I think that's the point of disconnect that like often people have a really hard time like making that jump. They're like, okay, like forests, rainforests, tigers, orangutans, hold on, like revolution. But like when you start to learn what political ecology means and like the history of Indonesia, and it's not an accident that the kind of subdiscipline of like university research / like activism that political ecology is. One of the original places it kind of came to exist was Indonesia. Why? Well, it's like, look, the teak forests of Indonesia were all cut down to create the Dutch and Portuguese colonial fleets that dominated the world. Like these things are just so intimately connected in like a much more like fundamental struggle kind of way than I think. Mostly it's just the fact that like we're taught them, or like a lot of people come to learn about endangered species through like WWF, which is like, the whole board of WWF is corporate America, or like banking even, or like finance. So of course, like a lot of it does come down to like how we learn about these issues and experience them. But like, that's the beauty of land back, that like in all of our neighborhoods, communities, there are movements, there are indigenous First Nations, there's, the Ohlone people in the Bay Area where I'm from that have, and I talk about this in the conclusion of the book, they've reclaimed a ton of land in the Bay where land is so expensive, so policed, so enforced. The minute you don't pay your rent, like you're going to be evicted by armed sheriffs, like Moms for Housing occupying one house. Like they had like hundreds of riot police like responding at their eviction. Even within that milieu, like, the Segurite Land Trust represented by a few Ohlone peoples, or a Ohlone family basically, has been able to find a way to reclaim land in a place like the Bay. And they now have like 6 different land reclamations in the Bay, like of a number of acres each. And they've like pursued more of like a legal like land trust model, basically land being donated to them by philanthropists and also like state agencies. But I'm down for it. Like I think revolutionary struggle is needed, and I think Segurite Land Trust is needed as well. So yeah, that's how we kind of think about the revolutionary connections with ecology and soils, and just how critical that type of work, like that type of guerrilla gardening is, and how it can be in the cities. The Bay Area has shown that. Detroit has shown that with Feed 'em Freedom, and many places in the South, Planting Justice, like these spots that are taking urban areas and restoring soils and growing food. Like this is actually a revolutionary practice that like people have taken very seriously for a very long time. And anyone that wants to somehow convince you that like growing your own food is not a political revolutionary practice, like they might be right if that's the only thing these people do. But in the end, it's also a politically activating activity, getting involved, like reclaiming land and planting food on it. You get activated in different ways. And so, I think that those folks just aren't really paying attention. I think it's actually one of the most important places we can all put our efforts in, like on the day-to-day. We all need our own little patch of reclaimed land where we're trying to grow like a squash on or something.
Yeah, and when you're directly like getting your livelihood off of the land base that you're on, you're going to pay more attention to it. You're going to be invested in defending it. It's going to be a lot harder to cut off your supply lines for your community if you are building some independence, because there's like it's directly underneath you. And I think that there's also an element of the conservation ideology that things like the World Wildlife Fund and other organizations, the Sierra Club, are very much based on this concept of the separation between human beings and the natural world. And I think that an important part of this indigenous influence and the concept of being in a place that the book talks about is the fact that like humans aren't separate from nature. We are nature. We're part of nature. It's a matter of like, are we living in balance with what's around us and who's around us? Or are we living in opposition, extracting, and then trying to move on to another place to extract from? Like that sort of like disconnection from a land. I'm not trying to get all blood and soil on this. And I'm also not trying to claim that people identifying with the land base makes them indigenous. But I think that there's a close tie between that investment, understanding of, and viewing the land base as a member of your family, that you're not going to screw it over. You're going to worry about what's going to grow back next year. You're going to worry about like, what are you leaving for the next generation or the next 7 generations or whatever.
Absolutely.
So how have your friends in Casiavera been doing these days since the writing of the book? Like I know there's a lot of people's names that are dropped, whether I'm made up or pseudonyms or whatever. Like you obviously build a lot of relationships with people, and that's a valuable part of the story that you tell. Do you keep in contact with folks? How's the organizing going?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, it's been really neat to know that the book's been received well there. And yeah, I'm in touch with folks for sure. And I mean, these struggles are never done. That's something that I've been learning over the decades now, of like being in these, especially places that are really trying to hold back these giant like mega projects. Like you may win a victory, and then like 10 years later the project comes back in like almost the same form, but like maybe they've changed the legal structure around it or the scope of it a little bit, and they're going to slide through. Or like, like Standing Rock, the Dakota Access Pipeline, like it was built like despite all that movement energy. And there have been some recent pipeline successes, but like so many of these places, like we build from them, we learn from them, even if they might not exist anymore. But like I'm so glad to say that like Casiavera still exists. It's there. The form is there. People seem to be doing good. There are some interesting like new threats to the land that actually speak a lot to like the way that capitalism is changing in our world. One of them is like kind of local government authorities wanted to build a hotel on the land, and they wanted to turn it into like this kind of touristification of the place because it was so nice and so beautiful now with this forest and the cinnamon trees growing in there and the avocados. And they're like, well, let's build a hotel on it. We'll only kick off like most of the people. We'll keep most of the forest there. And so then like they had to reactivate the network, especially the peasant union, like the main organizer. That's like, I mean, he's not the main organizer, but he's one of my most important people that I talk about, like an organizer in the book, the founder of the West Sumatran Peasant Union, which then became part of the Indonesian Peasant Union. And he was his parents named him the name of the volcano Aden, where he was born, which I think was like such a power move at the start. Like you have to have some certain feelings about that child, I feel like, to name like your child the name of the place you live that's also a volcano. Like Aden, like it panned out. He became like an early pioneering lawyer and organizer for just destroying the dictatorship. I mean, that was their first, when they were young, that was their main thing. But then they learned they needed, to bite off that really revolutionary goal, like in more concrete material factors like land occupations and how effective they were to actually improve people's material conditions before any broader revolution had happened. So yeah, Aden told me they had to like rejuvenate their form of organizing, and they defeated this hotel proposal. That was no joke. Like there were a lot of people involved, a lot of money, a lot of investors were interested. The state loved the idea. And of course, this kind of gentrification, touristification of the world is a serious issue now. It sounds like to my younger self, I would have been like, that's nothing like building a mine in a place or something. And it's, it's different, but it really threatens people and cultures across the world at this point, like the touristification of the world. And it's not just the fact that tourists come. That's not the main thing. It's the fact that like capitalist economy finds a way to control the economy of that place. And everything can change through touristification. And so, yeah, they defeated that. But then in this really almost inspiring, I wish I had time to get this into an epilogue, there was a bit of a twist on that struggle where after the fact, the peasant union and some of the collectives that have been operating there were like, but you know what? That was kind of a good idea. And they didn't build a hotel, but they built a really simple coffee shop that now they run as a collective where they're like serving, coffee grown literally in the backyard, and they have like snacks that all local produce, and it fits into their mission. And I just think that hopefully it'll be another way that they can, gain economic sustenance and well-being from. And it's basically capitalist, I guess. I don't know. They're buying and selling. I mean, anyway, I think that I don't necessarily think that markets are bad, and I don't think markets are at all the same as capitalism. That's kind of how I think about it in my own like frameworks. And so they are commodifying the place a bit more, I think, with their cafe, their tourist kind of cafe stop. But I also think it's kind of cool and a sign of how it's growing and still sustained. And I think so there's been some tough things there. Like, I mean, just those mundane parts of life, like people passing away and new kids being born. And for me, the big question is like, how are they going to manage this handing over of both power and also control of the land to the next generation? And this is actually really an outstanding question, like a question that is kind of never answered in the book, but I pose like, people talk about their children inheriting their plots on the land, but that's technically not allowed by the way that the council and even the peasant union set up this form of non-property use, as you said, like usufruct use. This right to use it is only as long as you're actually using it, but then you're not supposed to let it go on to your children. So, yeah, how are they going to reformulate for the next generation, make room for them, bring them in? These intergenerational like connections are really important for our movements, for all of our movements. I'm starting to feel that now, passing over 40. I'm like, how many young activists am I building with? There are some. I feel grateful to have some in my life. A lot of them are through the universities, though, which is cool. I mean, that's one of the most coolest parts of working at a university is like I do get to interact with a lot of young people. But I start to worry about with, the truly like most anarchist, like mutual aid kind of like info shop kind of vibe place organizing. Are there these institutional structures that are going to like allow transfer of knowledge from everything we learned from like Occupy to, our veterans to our people that have been incarcerated? Are we going to pass it on? Like, I don't even know if any of our websites and blogs are going to even last like 5 years, let alone 15. Whereas, in the 60s, I grew up in Berkeley. There were a lot of magazines and pamphlets and posters around in my parents' house and their friend's house. The Berkeley Bar, radical newspapers, like that's how I learned about a lot of my own history, right? So, yeah, I'm thinking about that for Casiavera a lot. And I think that there's no doubt that these type of projects are only going to be, I shouldn't call them projects, but these type of movements, are only going to kind of be like these liminal, not forever type of movements until we get broader systemic change. Like we see that with the Zapatistas, I think, are right now people are worried about them being engulfed in drug violence and immigration problems and just kind of, the tide is rising in many ways, I think, and it always will, like unless we have broader like systemic changes that allow places like Casiavera not just to be these tiny little islands floating in this really exploitive sea. So yeah, I think that's the broader horizon, is understanding that these places are going to inspire us. They're going to give us some real tools and like insight of how to organize, but that they need more broader mobilization to survive, like at least, as long as 100 years or something. Nothing's forever, like nothing would be permanent, right? But let's think about how to achieve permanence. Like it only really comes through, I think, broader revolutionary change.
Yeah, it doesn't mean the structures have to exist as they stand, but we do have, as enemies, incorporated things that have power, that have institutional memory, that accumulate over time, that are, whether it be states or corporations, are enemies that are trying to extract and centralize and like pull profits and disinter us, and don't have a care because they aren't living entities for the actual soil that we all live with and on. How do we not reproduce that? Like, to talk about like Freddie Perlman's thoughts on like becoming, like wanting to have that longevity and becoming the thing that we are trying to defend against by adopting its ways and methods. Yeah, I think that networks of communication, reciprocity, mutualism, respect can lead the way towards this, like towards the possibility of intergenerational federative resistance. And we've only got, it's not like we've got forever to work on this too. Between nuclear war or the climate, the global temperatures rising, the seas dying off, whatever. It's it's dire, but I like the fact that I feel like this book is a good contribution to the general conversation that you find in like one of Peter Gelderloos's more recent books, for instance. The Answers Are Already Here, I think that's the name of it.
Yep.
Yeah, it sort of like tells a little bit of some of the story that I think Peter was trying to point to as possibilities and places that we can learn lessons from people doing it, like making mistakes along the way, making imperfection, but, putting themselves into it, investing and creating the world that they want to live in.
Yeah, big shout out to Peter, and another Barcelona expat or immigrant or exile, we should say, maybe.
Yeah. So I guess the last question I have is, are you working on anything else these days? Would you suggest any interesting subjects, groups, movements, places, or struggles for further study around the topics that you've discussed today or covered in your book? And I made a list of some of the organizations like Wali or Via Campesina or Landless Movement, the MTS. So I'll have some of that stuff in the show notes with links to the organizations. But yeah, any other shout outs or stuff that you're working on right now?
Yeah, I'm really interested in trying to break down like ways of, how do we understand history of social movements in a way that can inform our present conjuncture, our moment right here, right now, around like strategy and tactics more. Like I want to really use those tools of like humanistic inquiry and scholarship. So yeah, I've been thinking a lot about, just tactics of like anti-capitalist strategy and what those might mean for different places, and also like trying to push forward like my own ability to draw like comparison or relations across like Indonesia, California, Barcelona, also South America, like Amazonia. So yeah, I have another book that I'm working on that is very much like just about this idea of like not so much places, but actual just like what are different tactics that are out there in the world. So I have chapters I've started to write on. Like some of them are inspired by my experience with Via Campesina and SPI and MST, like the occupation, but also like the blockade, of course, and thinking about another great one are like the Zadis or the zone to defend movements in France that are movements to stop big capitalist infrastructure projects. And they've been really effective with like the protest camp, kind of like Dakota Access Pipeline, Standing Rock struggles, like employed basically the same type of thing, like create a big protest encampment in the way of some of these projects. So yeah, the Zadis in France, I've been learning more about now that I've been out here, and all just set within this like idea of, okay, like, I don't know what you think about the U.S. state, but I don't see it being like the source of any actual well-being or like potential for change right now. So we need these tactics of direct action more than ever, but we need to know like how they apply in a more broad sense. Which one is, which pillar first against what? Like I'm trying to learn more about, like different types of like, if this workplace strike, and like mad respect to like Amazon workers organizing, wildcat strikes. I was part of the largest academic strike in U.S. history a few years ago with the UC Berkeley system, incorporated through the UFO. Okay, mad respect to these people, but I just have to say it. The workplace strike seems dead to me. So what is like the strike? The debt strike or the rent strike? Or those things also seem to like lack a certain ability to actually do them in the U.S. So I'm hoping to learn, are there some places that are putting the strike into new form that we can really use? And the riot, there's been some really interesting, like just riots recently and in the recent past that I think should inspire a lot of us. There's also like, there's this group called Waging Nonviolence, whatever. They actually have some people that are trying to look into protest numbers right now under Trump. They're arguing that more people are protesting now than during the first Trump administration. It's just that the press isn't covering it this time. And like, it's almost like sounds too hard to believe, but they're being very diligent in counting like protest numbers. They're being very rigorous and academic. So that's kind of what I'm trying to work on right now. And like, what does internationalism mean within all of this? Like, the communists had their first international. Like there was even a first anarchist international in the early 1900s. But like, where's the role for internationalism today? And those are the things I'm kind of trying to figure out how to research in a real experiential role, like as an activist, academic. There's been some learning curves, but hopefully I'm going to have, something out in another year or so.
Cool. And, your website is davidegilbert.com. Is that right?
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Yeah. So that's a place I'm sure you'll be updating. And are you on social media that you want to shout out, or are you off of that stuff?
Yeah. I jumped off of Twitter, although my account's still up there to Blue Sky, but I'm not super active on it. But it'd be great to connect with you there if I'm not connected yet. And I'm sure you have an awesome audience. And I'd love to start using that platform a little bit more if that's the right one. It's wild. Like Telegram is just huge in Europe. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really realize, like I'd heard about Telegram before I came out here, but now it's so active and it's just, it's just not as public. But I don't know how do you share like Telegram handles? Do I have to give out my phone number? I don't want to do that, but
I can find you the way, but there are some suggestions on if you're going to have a Telegram account to hide personal information.
Oh yeah.
So you can make yourself non-searchable by your number, or sign it up to a Google number. Sometimes that works. But usually if you've got a channel, like just a broadcast only channel, then you would just, that you can get a short link that's like t.me/ whatever the name of it is. But yeah, Telegram it's an interesting platform. It should not be trusted for security because they have a history of, it's a Russian-based corporation that has handed over information from radical groups and from attendees in different channels on there to both the Russian government and the Belarusian government, and I'm sure other governments beyond that. When people are like organizing demonstrations, law enforcement has a back access to it. So if security is a concern for either the attendees of a group or for communications, it's not great. I'm a fan of Mastodon, but it doesn't have the same following, and it's way more decentralized. But
yeah, I like that one too. I need to just get like a solid, small community of people I follow on Mastodon on one of those servers. I think I'd be happy with that. I'm like just so happy to have like It's Going Down back in my life. Once I signed up for Blue Sky, I didn't realize they were on there. I was like, oh, this was worth it alone. Like, thank goodness. I was so sad and pissed when they got kicked off of Twitter. I was like, oh.
And Facebook and like Instagram. Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for having this conversation, for writing this book. I'm stoked to be able to share this with the audience and looking forward to the next stuff that you come out with.
Thanks. It's great to connect with you.
Yeah, mutual. This is The Final Straw Radio. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books. Located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville, Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.